Hey, what's up, mi gente? Today's video is all about the introduction into motion, where to find some of the common things you'll need to be looking for in the majority of the workspace. So let's get right into it. All right, so this is the first screen that you'll see when you get into motion. It is like where you want to start. So what's cool about motion is that it integrates itself with Apple Final Cut Pro 10. Now, you can use this just like you would do like After Effects or any other graphics tool. It's a overview of all the things and projects that you can create. The basic one is a motion project. This is a standalone project that you could then use and export for after or for Premiere or Final Cut or whatever, but you'd always have to come back to change the files, any files or assets in the project here in the actual motion project. You have your presets over here on the right and frame rates depending on the project you might have, the duration, and this gives you the basic idea of where things are at. Now you'll see there's 4 other project types. There's effects, generators, transition, and titles for Final Cut. Because Motion and Final Cut are made by Apple, they integrate seamlessly. So if you make a effect or generator or transition or title, which we'll go into in depth later in the series, you can then publish parameters and have those parameters be editable in Final Cut, and which makes it a super powerful tool, especially when staying in the ecosystem of Final Cut. So a great example is you can see that there's a whole bunch of these transitions and things that I have from different clients and projects in the past. And I have currently one that is a lower third. So what I'm going to do is for this example to showcase, I want to open this up. I'm just going to say OK to replacing the font there. Now, you have 3 main areas. You have the library and inspector area on the left-hand side. You have your layers, media, and audio tabs. So the layers section right here is kind of like your Photoshop area. It's going to be anything that is grouped and what effects or behavior are added to that specific object, and it just works exactly like in Photoshop. If something's underneath, that means that layer is gonna anything above a specific item is going to overpower and overtake anything underneath it, depending on how you have things set up. The media tab is going to show you where you're getting like an image or any other media assets, especially if you're doing a lot of like heavy animation stuff, and as well as audio. This is where you're going to see any audio information. Then you have your viewer, and then this will be your main kind of workspace. You have a lot of different options. You can choose that by kind of seeing where you want your resolution, as well as like if you want to see the transparency of the object, or alpha overlay, where anything's red is alpha channel, that sort of thing. You can change that here, as well as kind of like, if you want to see the rulers and grid and all the sorts of things that might help benefit you to know what is to get your design pixel perfect. Underneath here in the lower section is where your timeline is at, and this is where a lot of the details and information go. So like I was saying, your layers project is going to reflect here in the timeline. So anything, if you want to move something, you have to move it up here in the layers area. And you have a lot of things going on here. So anything in purple is usually a effect or behavior. If you see, you can click here to see keyframes. If you have it, this is all done with behaviors, but if you had keyframes here, you would then see a red dot and line with the keyframes. If you also click the keyframe editor, which is this like 3-dotted icon, this is where you could adjust the keyframes of objects. So here, this is already, this is with behaviors, but you could, depending on what you adjust with the inspector. So the inspector is where most of the detail is going to happen. So your library on the left-hand side is going to be where you can find like filters, like effects, current generators that are pre-built in here. And that's kind of what's cool about Motion, is that there's a whole bunch of different little things already pre-built here that you can then use to customize with your effects or whatnot. So if you see up here, so you have gradients and fonts and all sorts of cool things. You can pull in your music from Apple, your Apple Music, anything that you've might have here. A lot of awesome and interesting things. That means so that you don't have to like create something from scratch and figure out how to do things. You can always just drop it into the timeline and kind of mess around with what they already have built, which is really awesome, especially when you just want to mess around or you want to not start from an empty slate. But a lot of times we're going to go into how you can quickly add behaviors and some other filters. But when you want to have, if you want to, you're not sure if it's something there, it's always kind of fun to come in here and search around. Now, but like I was saying, the inspector is where all the details information is going to be found for a specific thing. So over here I have a title layer, which is for Adi Lucci. And this is just placeholder text. And if I come over here in the inspector, I can see that I have properties for position, rotation, and the major stuff. In the behaviors section, you will see any behaviors that have been added to the specific layer. So if it's an image or whatever, you'll see these purple lines, and then they will correspond over here with their individual parameters. That's what they're called. So you can see that the path shape, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can mess around in here, and we'll talk about that in later videos. Next up is filters. So if you have any filters like Gaussian blur or whatever, this is where you would you change those, and they affect the same way that they have here. You can always turn off things by clicking the checkbox to make sure that you can isolate one little specific thing. And then finally you have the text option. Now text has 3 sub options. So you have the format, so like the types of fonts, where it's centered, blah, 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 as well as the appearance. So this is like the colors, drop shadows, outlines, that sort of thing. And then you have layout, which is a lot more advanced stuff, which for the most part I haven't had to deal with or mess around with, but maybe later on in the course we'll figure out what we can do. The only other things I want to kind of mention is like the HUD example. This kind of brings up a lot of the things that are in the behaviors or inspector situation, but in this heads up display that allows you to quickly adjust things without having to go to the inspector. Some of them have additional, depending on the behavior or effect or whatever you might be doing, have other specific things that make it a little bit easier than actually using the inspector. So sometimes when we look into things, we will often open up the HUD just to see what's going on there and see if it's beneficial. You can also replicate something that you've created, or make a particle from anything that you've created, like a shape. We'll go into all that sort of thing later on. But for now, I wanted to also just mention that there's the share option. And this is similar to Final Cut Pro, where you can set up presets, or they have the standard things that's there. And we'll go into exporting in a later video. The last thing I just kind of wanted to mention was there is actually a preferred method that I like to do. So this is the classic like view, but I actually like the cinema view. And the cinema view actually gives you the inspectors and layers, or sorry, the layers and media stuff on the left. It gives you the inspector and library on the right, and the main content in the center. And this is kind of similar to how I have Final Cut set up with like your library and stuff like that, and then your inspector on the right. And so that's why I prefer it. But you can always switch back by going to Windows, and then so when you go to Windows Layout, and then Classic or Cinema. So that's just a quick little intro into Motion, and I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, let us know in the comments below.